She was 19, and her uncle had made her homeless. She had no family left, no money to speak of, no plan, just a heavy iron key her grandmother had left her and the $37 her uncle had pressed into her hand. And with a portion of that $37, she bought a surveyor's map of the Bitterroot foothills. But what nobody knew was that the key in her pocket and a faint pencil mark on that map pointed the way to a stone house, a house built for the day a girl like her would need it most. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Nora Bassett had grown up in the lee of her grandmother's quiet competence. Her name was Eleanor Bassett, and she had been a woman who understood the language of wood grain and weather, of soil and seasons. She was widowed long before Nora was born, and she ran the small family farm not with brute strength, but with a patient, knowing economy of motion. Eleanor's hands, though gnarled by work and age, were instruments of creation. Nora remembered those hands planing a warped door until it swung true in its frame, setting a splint on a lamb's broken leg with strips of clean linen, and holding Nora's own small hands to guide a saw through a length of pine. "Let the tool do the work, child," she would say, her voice as soft and worn as old leather. "Your job is just to guide it." Eleanor taught Nora how to read the sky for rain, how to mix mortar, how to sharpen an axe, and how to listen to the silence of the high mountains and know what it was saying. The farm was their world, a small universe of 40 acres bounded by a creek and a stand of old-growth cedar. After Nora's parents died in a fever winter when she was only 6, Eleanor had been her only family, her teacher, and her shelter. The most precious thing Nora owned from that time, besides the skills themselves, was an old iron key. It was heavy, nearly 5 inches long, with an ornate clover-shaped bow and a complex, toothed bit. It went to no lock on the farm. "It's for a door you haven't found yet," Eleanor had told her once, a rare smile touching her lips. Some doors wait a long time to be opened. When Eleanor passed away in her sleep one spring morning, the world Nora had known fell silent. Her uncle Thomas, her father's younger brother whom she had met only twice, arrived from the city a week later. He smelled of cigars and impatience, and his city boots seemed to violate the soft earth of the farm. He saw not a home, but an asset, not a legacy, but a parcel of land with timber rights. He was a man who saw the world through ledgers and deeds, and in his accounting, a 19-year-old niece was a liability to be settled and dismissed. The ejection was not a moment of high drama, but of quiet, administrative cruelty. It happened on a Tuesday in late August, the air thick with the smell of cut hay and the coming autumn. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the very table where Eleanor had taught Nora to knead bread, and laid out a set of papers. His signature was already affixed, a sharp, angular script that seemed to stab at the page. "The farm is sold, Nora," he said, not looking at her. He tapped a finger on the document. "The new owners take possession on Friday. You'll need to be gone by then." Nora stood by the dry sink, her hands clutching a damp dishcloth. She did not cry or plead. She had watched her grandmother face down drought, blight, and the loss of her own husband, with a stoicism that was less an absence of feeling and more a deep well of conserved strength. Nora drew from that well now. She simply nodded. "Where am I to go?" she asked, her voice even. Thomas finally looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. "That's not my concern. You're 19, an adult." He pushed a small stack of bills across the table. "This is what's left after settling Eleanor's debts and my travel expenses. $37. He said the amount as if it were a generous settlement, a final closing of the books on his familial obligations. Nora looked at the worn bills, then at her uncle's polished shoes. She thought of the years her grandmother had poured into this land, the calluses on her hands, the sweat that had fed the very soil beneath their feet. All of it reduced to a sum that would barely buy a week's worth of meals. She didn't touch the money. She turned and walked to the small bedroom that had been hers her entire life. She packed a single canvas satchel, 2 changes of clothes, a block of soap, a tinderbox, and the small leather-bound toolbox her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. It held a good hammer, a set of chisels, a small hand plane, and a sharpening stone. Into her pocket, she slipped the heavy iron key. When she returned to the kitchen, Thomas was gone. The $37 remained on the table. She picked it up, folded it once, and tucked it away. She walked out the kitchen door without looking back, the screen door slapping shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed across the empty yard. The air was still and warm, and the mountains, the great, silent Bitterroots, watched her go. The journey began on foot. Nora walked down the long dirt lane that connected the farm to the county road, the dust rising in soft puffs around her worn leather boots. She did not look back. To look back was to invite a grief she did not have the strength to carry. Not yet. The weight of the canvas satchel on her shoulder was a grounding reality. The solid presence of her grandmother's tools, a comfort against her back. The road unspooled before her, a pale ribbon winding through the familiar landscape of rolling pastures and hayfields. But with every mile, the land began to change. The fields grew smaller, interrupted by stands of ponderosa pine and aspen groves that shimmered gold in the late summer sun. The road began to climb, gently at first, then more insistently, into the foothills. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine resin and cool stone. She walked for 2 days, sleeping rolled in her blanket under the vast, star-dusted sky, eating the bread and dried apples she had packed. On the 3rd day, she reached the small town of Harmony Creek, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a narrow valley. It was little more than a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of houses. In the Mercantile, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salt pork, she spent 2 of her $37 on a surveyor's map of the region. It was old, the paper yellowed and soft, but the topographical lines were clear. She spread it out on the store's counter, its surface worn smooth by a century of commerce. And there, in the far northwest quadrant, in a crease of the paper, was a faint, familiar mark. It was a small, neatly drawn circle made in pencil, with the initial E beside it. Eleanor. Nora's heart gave a small, sharp knock against her ribs. She remembered her grandmother poring over this very map years ago, her finger tracing the contours of the high country. She had thought nothing of it then. Now, it felt like a message sent across time. She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, and a packet of jerky, her precious funds dwindling. She asked the storekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, about the mark. "That's old government land up there?" the woman said, squinting at the map. "Homestead claim, most likely. Nothing's been up that way for 40 years or more. No road, just an old game trail." Nora folded the map carefully and put it in her satchel. She had a destination now. It wasn't a plan, not really, but it was a direction. It was a thread to follow, spun by the hands of the one person who had never failed her. The next morning, she left Harmony Creek and struck north, following the creek that gave the town its name, pushing deeper into the mountains, toward the small pencil mark that held the shape of a promise. The game trail was little more than a whisper of a path, a faint impression in the pine needles and rocky soil that snaked its way up the side of the mountain. For 2 days, Nora climbed, the world of roads and towns falling away below. The air was sharp and cool, and the only sounds were the rush of the wind through the high pines, the chatter of a squirrel, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was tired, her muscles aching with a fatigue that went bone deep, but there was a clean, sharp focus to her mind. She thought of her grandmother's hands, how they could find the straightest grain in a piece of wood, and she felt that she was doing the same, following the grain of the land toward an unknown purpose. On the afternoon of the second day of climbing, she found it. The trail opened into a small, high meadow, a bowl of green grass ringed by ancient firs, and there, on the far side of the meadow, tucked against a granite cliff face, was a house. It was made of stone, not rough field stone, but carefully cut and fitted granite blocks, the work of a master mason. The stones were a patchwork of gray and rose, silvered with lichen, and a thick carpet of moss grew on the heavy slate roof. A stone chimney, broad and solid, stood sentinel at one end. The windows were shuttered with thick, weathered planks, and a heavy oak door, bound with iron straps, was set deep into the front wall. It looked less like a house, and more like a part of the mountain itself, something that had grown there rather than been built. A feeling of profound stillness hung over the place. It was not the stillness of abandonment, but of patience, of something waiting. A small, clear stream ran from the rocks nearby, feeding a patch of wild berry bushes. As she drew closer, she saw the details of the craftsmanship. The joints between the stones were tight and true. The lintel above the door was a single, massive piece of hewn granite. This was not a hastily erected shack. It was a fortress, built to endure. She felt a tremor of recognition, a sense of rightness that settled deep in her chest. She dropped her satchel in the long grass and walked to the door. There was no rust on the iron hinges, only a dark patina of age. In the center of the door was a large, formidable iron lock. With a hand that trembled slightly, Nora reached into her pocket and drew out the heavy key. It felt cool and solid in her palm. She looked from the key's complex, toothed bit to the shape of the keyhole. They were a perfect match. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled precision, followed by a deep, resonant thunk as the bolt slid back. The sound echoed in the mountain silence. It was the sound of a door that had been waiting a very long time to be opened. Nora pushed the heavy oak door inward. It swung silently on its hinges, opening into a single, large room filled with cool, still air and the faint, dry scent of cedar and old stone. A fine layer of dust coated everything, a soft gray blanket over a world held in perfect suspension. Sunlight, filtered through the grimy panes of a single unshuttered window high in the gable, cut a golden shaft through the gloom, illuminating a dance of dust motes. The room was simply furnished, but everything in it spoke of quality and intention. Against the far wall stood a large stone fireplace, its hearth clean and swept, with a stack of dry, seasoned firewood laid neatly beside it. A cast-iron cookstove stood near the hearth, its black surface dull with disuse but free of rust. In the center of the room was a heavy trestle table and 2 simple, sturdy chairs. A built-in bunk, piled with neatly folded wool blankets, occupied one corner, and along the opposite wall were shelves, filled not with clutter but with essentials: sealed tins, glass jars of dried beans and grains, sacks of flour and sugar, and neatly labeled wooden crates. It was a shelter, provisioned and prepared. Nora ran a hand over the smooth, planed surface of the table. It was the work of a skilled carpenter. She recognized the joinery, the careful fit of mortise and tenon, as her grandmother's work. This whole place was her grandmother's work. She felt Eleanor's presence not as a ghost, but as a palpable intelligence, a loving foresight that had reached across the years to this very moment. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, her initial awe settling into a deep, quiet gratitude. She unlatched and opened the heavy wooden shutters, letting fresh air and light flood the room. She found a well-made pump at a stone sink that, after a few moments of priming, brought up clear, cold water from a deep well. Behind the house, a small, sturdy shed held a trove of tools: axes, saws, a post-hole digger, a scythe, and a splitting maul, all cleaned, oiled, and sharp. There was even a small forge and anvil. It was a complete and self-sufficient world, built with a purpose Nora was only just beginning to understand. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the meadow, Nora felt a pang of deep, aching loneliness. The house was a gift, a miracle, but it was also a monument to her solitude. She laid a fire in the hearth, just as Eleanor had taught her, and as the flames caught and began to crackle, she noticed it. One of the hearthstones was slightly loose. It was barely perceptible, but her fingers, trained to notice such imperfections, found the slight give. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, she took a chisel from her toolbox and gently worked it into the seam. The mortar was old, but gave way easily. She lifted the heavy stone. Beneath it was not dirt, but a hollow space lined with tin. And inside that space lay a small steel cash box. With a trembling heart, she lifted it out. It was heavy. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were stacks of banknotes, neatly bound with string, a sum far greater than she could have imagined. And beneath the money lay a leather-bound ledger and a single, sealed envelope addressed in her grandmother's familiar, steady hand. The address read simply, "For the one who holds the key." Nora carried the cash box to the table and sat down, the firelight flickering across the room, casting warm, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Her hands were steady as she broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The ink was faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. "My dearest girl, if you are reading this, then the world has been unkind to you, and I am no longer there to stand between you and its hardness. I am sorry for that. I built this house for you, though I did not know your name or face when I laid the first stone. I built it for the daughter of my son, for the Bassett who would come after me and need a place to be safe. I began this house the year your grandfather died. Thomas, your uncle, was already a man with a taste for the city and for easy money. I knew then that the farm would not be safe forever. I knew he would not see it as a home, but as something to be sold. So I began to build a different kind of inheritance, one that could not be signed away or sold for profit. I bought this land quietly, and for 10 years I brought supplies up here, a little at a time. I cut every stone and set it with my own hands. I raised every beam. This house is made of my love for a future I would not see. In the cash box, you will find $5,000. It is the money from every good timber sale, every surplus calf, every bit I could save over 30 years. Use it to buy what you need, to be beholden to no one. In the ledger you will find my accounting. Every nail, every pane of glass, every tool, and where it was purchased. You will also find notes on this land. where the soil is best for a garden, where the deer cross in winter, where the best fishing can be found in the creek. It is a map of this life, should you choose to live it. This house is strong. It will keep you warm in winter and cool in summer. It will stand long after we are all gone. Be good to it, and it will be good to you. Live a life of your own making, Nora. Be brave, be kind, and let the tool do the work. With all my love, your grandmother, Eleanor Bassett. Nora read the letter 3 times, her fingers tracing the faded signature. The grief she had held at bay finally broke over her, not in a storm of tears, but as a quiet, profound ache of love and loss. She was not crying for what she had lost, but for the impossible depth of what she had been given. Her grandmother had foreseen it all: the sale of the farm, the callousness of her son, the moment a 19-year-old girl would be left with nothing. And she had answered that future cruelty with a slow, patient, and monumental act of love. Nora opened the ledger. Page after page was filled with Eleanor's neat script, detailing dates, costs, and materials. June 1952, 12 bags Portland cement, $8.40 from Harmony Creek Mercantile. August 1954, 2 kegs of 16-penny nails, $11. September 1958, window glass custom cut from Missoula Glass and Trim, $43.25. It was the secret history of her grandmother's life, a testament to decades of quiet, determined labor. The money was a tool, the ledger a guide, and the house a shelter. It was everything she needed. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for the first time since her grandmother's death, Nora did not feel alone. She felt seen. She felt known. She felt finally home. The next morning, Nora woke with the sun. The grief had settled into a quiet resolve, a sense of purpose as solid as the stone walls around her. Her grandmother had not just left her a refuge. She had left her a life's work. The rebuilding began not with a grand plan, but with small, deliberate acts. First, she took a bucket and a stiff brush to the floors, scrubbing away the decades of dust until the wide pine planks shone, their grain a warm honey color in the morning light. She washed the windows until the mountain light streamed in, clear and bright. She beat the dust from the wool blankets and aired them in the sun-drenched meadow. Each task was a conversation with her grandmother, a way of saying, "Thank you, I am here. I will be a worthy steward of this gift." The money gave her the freedom to provision without fear. After a week of settling in, she walked back down the mountain to Harmony Creek, her satchel filled with a list drawn from her grandmother's ledger. At the Mercantile, she met the owner again, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose calm gaze seemed to take in Nora's worn clothes and the quiet determination in her eyes. Nora did not display her wealth, but asked to open an account, placing a $100 bill on the counter as a deposit. Mrs. Gable raised an eyebrow, but simply nodded, her respect earned not by the money, but by the seriousness in Nora's request for seed packets, lamp oil, and a new whetstone. It was Silas Croft, the town's carpenter and blacksmith, who became her first true ally. He was a man in his late 60s, with hands as gnarled as oak roots and a face mapped with a lifetime of quiet observation. Nora found him in his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and hot metal, and asked to purchase seasoned lumber to repair a section of the shed roof. He looked at her carefully. "That's a 2-day haul up the mountain for a mule team," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What's a girl like you doing with a place that needs that kind of work?" Nora simply met his gaze. "It's my place," she said, "and the work needs doing." Silas studied her for a long moment, then a slow smile touched his lips. He saw the competence in her, the echo of another woman he had known long ago who bought supplies and spoke little of her purpose. "Eleanor Bassett's girl," he said, more a statement than a question. "I'll be. I helped her haul the anvil for that forge of hers 30 years back. She was a fine builder." He agreed to sell her the lumber, and seeing the earnest set of her jaw, offered more. "I'll come up myself Saturday, help you set the rafters. An old friend's memory is worth that much." And so he did. He arrived on a sturdy mule laden with lumber and taught her how to brace the new beams, how to measure the cuts with precision, his gruff instructions a form of deep respect for her willingness to learn and work. He showed her how to heat and shape a broken hinge in the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil a kind of music that echoed in the high meadow. He asked for no payment, but accepted a hot meal and a cup of strong coffee, sitting at her table and sharing stories of her grandmother's quiet trips to town for supplies all those years ago. He was the first person to see her not as a displaced girl, but as the rightful heir to the stone house, a new homesteader in a long tradition of them. Slowly, Nora's life took on the rhythm of the seasons, her existence becoming intertwined with the house and the small community of Harmony Creek. She was no longer the lost girl who had walked out of her old life with nothing, but the Bassett girl in the stone house, a figure of quiet industry and self-reliance. Her weekly trips to town became a ritual. She would walk the now familiar trail, her pack laden with mended tools for Silas, or a jar of the wild berry jam she'd learned to make for Mrs. Gable, and return with salt, coffee, and news of the valley. Mrs. Gable would save her the day-old bread and give her a fair price for the neat bundles of dried herbs Nora gathered from the mountainside. Silas taught her how to trap, how to read the tracks of elk and deer, and how to properly cure the hides. In return, Nora used her smaller, nimbler hands to repair the intricate workings of the town's clocks and music boxes, a skill Eleanor had passed down. One afternoon, a young man named Finn, who worked the small ranch down in the valley, appeared at her meadow leading a horse. "Silas sent me," he said, his voice shy. "Said you were clearing land for a garden. This is Rose. She's old, but she'll pull a plow better than you can with that shovel." Nora offered him payment, but he shook his head. "Just a share of the first potatoes is all." Together, they spent a week turning the rich soil of the meadow, the old horse patiently leaning into the harness, the plow biting deep. Finn spoke little, but his presence was a steady comfort. They worked in a shared silence, the only sounds the jingle of the harness, the cry of a hawk overhead, and the soft thud of stone pulled from the earth. When the garden was plowed and planted according to the notes in Eleanor's ledger, Nora's place in the community had been solidified. She was a provider, a craftswoman, a neighbor. People began to seek her out. A rancher's wife brought her a stack of torn work shirts to mend, paying her in jars of fresh milk. The preacher asked her to repair a sticking key on the church organ. She was no longer living on her grandmother's savings, but on the currency of her own skills. Her inheritance transformed from a cache of money into a sustainable life. The stone house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, a workshop, a place of belonging. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the scent of wood smoke, and the low hum of a life being built, one sturdy, well-made piece at a time. The community had not embraced her with grand gestures, but had woven her into its fabric through 100 small, practical acts of mutual need and respect. She was one of them now. One evening in late autumn, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Nora sat at the heavy trestle table, the warm glow of the oil lamp pushing back the deep mountain darkness. A fire crackled in the hearth her grandmother had built, its heat radiating into the room. A steady, living presence. The air was filled with the scent of pine from the fire and the rich aroma of the venison stew simmering on the stove. Through the clean window panes, she could see the stars, sharp and brilliant in the cold, clear air. Her life had found its center. She had her garden put to bed for the winter, its bounty stored in the small root cellar she and Finn had dug. The woodshed was stacked high with firewood, enough to last until the spring thaw. The house was sound, the roof tight, the larder full. She had survived. More than that, she had thrived. On the table before her lay her grandmother's ledger, open to a page of notes on preparing for winter. Beside it lay the heavy iron key. She picked it up, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. This small piece of metal had been the beginning of everything. It was a key not just to a house, but to a life she could not have imagined. It was the physical manifestation of her grandmother's love, a love so powerful and prescient that it had reached across death to save her. She thought of her uncle, Thomas, of his dismissive gesture and his $37. He had cast her out with what he considered to be nothing, believing he had stripped her of her inheritance. He had been wrong. He had taken the land, but he had missed the legacy entirely. Eleanor's true inheritance wasn't the 40 acres of the farm. It was the knowledge in Nora's hands, the resilience in her heart, and the quiet foresight that had built this stone house as a bulwark against the world's carelessness. Nora looked around the room, at the smooth, solid walls, the sturdy furniture, the shelves laden with provisions. Every object was a testament to her grandmother's labor and her own. This was a place built by the hands of Bassett women, a fortress of love and competence. She was not just its keeper, she was its continuation. Nora Bassett was 19 and had been left with nothing but a key and $37. She had spent it all on a map, a little flour, and a new life. It was the best $37 she had ever spent. Her story is a reminder that the greatest inheritances are not always the ones found in a will, but are sometimes hidden, waiting for the right hands to find them. They are the skills we are taught, the resilience we are shown, and the love that prepares a place for us, even when the world has cast us out. We thank you for spending this time with us tonight. For more stories of quiet strength and hidden legacies, be sure to subscribe and share this with someone who might need it. And now, we leave you with a question to carry into your week. What is the most valuable thing you have ever been given that had nothing to do with money?